We have neared the end of 2018, and as I do every year, I like to look at all of the media I experienced this year and pick 18 favorites. Let's roll. There's been a lot of buzz going around about The Good Place, which is a strange show that takes place in a weird CGI fictionalized version of, I guess, the writer's imagination of the afterlife, in which there is a ranking system of whether you go to the good place or the bad place. Someone is in the good place and maybe isn't all the way there. There's some mystery plot things that are happening that I'm trying not to reveal. It takes an interesting look at some of the reasons that we do good in our lives and why we try to understand what goodness is in our lives. But the characters themselves are interesting and flawed and likable, and their relationships between one another are all really compelling and good and messy in just a very Michael Schur way that you've probably seen in Brooklyn Nine-Nine or Parks and Rec. I am partial to Brooklyn Nine-Nine in particular. But anyway, The Good Place. Don't want to spoil anything, but give it a watch. Queer Eye is a reality TV show in which 5 gay men come up to someone and try and change their lives a little bit in the form of grooming, culture, cooking, fashion, and decor. I forgot Bobby. Everyone does. I'm so sorry, Bobby. The premise itself isn't actually what's interesting about the show, especially since now, the subculture of queerness isn't that hidden anymore, and so it's not an interesting, oh, what are the gays doing? But because of the nature of their identities, these 5 men end up tackling subjects of masculinity and family dynamics and self-confidence and presentation and all sorts of kind of iffy topics that a lot of people, particularly men, don't have a lot of space to talk about and don't always feel comfortable talking about. And they do so with a lot of gentleness and kindness and love while still being very much themselves and actually drawing out the person they're making over. Alright, Doctor Who Season 11. Stephen Moffat has taken a well-deserved break from his overstayed welcome. Christopher Chibnall has come on the scene. Peter Capaldi respectfully left the show. He was very good and underrated. You should probably watch his seasons. However, Jodie Whittaker is a gem. It takes the show and keeps the core of it, but has a shift in tone that I really like. It takes out a lot of the swashbuckliness, which had gotten to the point of being overdone, and inserts a different kind of sincerity that I find it personally to be more feminine, but I know that can get kind of wiggy. The Doctor herself is wonderful. She's allowed to be quirky and smart and weird and confusing and strange and just put on some goggles and start welding together a new sonic screwdriver and just going and trying to defeat the aliens and bringing people along. There are 3 companions this season, and the dynamic between the 3 of them and the Doctor is just so compelling. I love them all. They all have their own unique stories and their ways of responding to things. The Doctor's affection for all of them is lovely, and she doesn't want to manipulate them or whisk them away or wow them. She just would like some honest friends, and if they don't want her to be in their lives, she is totally cool with respecting that, but of course they do, and they go on delightful adventures. Anyway, please check it out. If you're only gonna watch 1 episode, please watch Rosa. It's very good. If you've never watched Doctor Who, watch Rosa. It's very good. This isn't really a singular piece of media, but I really like Batman now. I wasn't all that into Batman before. I liked the cool detective stuff of the really old comics that I used to read. I got to listen to The Caped Crusade by Glenn Weldon, which is an absolute delight and a nerdy dive into geek culture and Batman over the years and the ways that people have responded to him and the fans' perception of Batman and the world's perception of Batman and stuff like that. I've been reading more Batman comics and kind of seeing that core of detectiveness, and I've gone from an attitude of Batman's superpowers, white privilege, to oh, here's this super mentally ill man who's struggling super hard to have justice exist in the world. So, I'm learning and growing, thanks to my handful of Batman friends for helping me along this journey. This has been a big year for me in podcasts as well. I started listening to the Penumbra podcast, which originally was supposed to be a Twilight Zone-esque episodic thing, but they ended up really developing a mainline series about a noir space detective who's on Mars. He's a really interesting character. He's this kind of specific... I don't think I've ever seen a queer depressed character portrayed so well. And that sort of self-loathing and angst that often manifests itself in heroes like this doesn't get portrayed as heroic. It gets portrayed as flawed, but his friends are willing to help him with that, but they're not willing to put up with nonsense. Also, the whole weird sci-fi aesthetic, and the different components of different genres that they brought in are super interesting. The voice actors are great. Also, I'm a sucker for detective stories and emotionally vulnerable main characters and cool sci-fi shenanigans. This was also the year that I was introduced to the McElroy family of podcasts, which contains more shows than I can count. Their first show is My Brother, and Me, an advice show in which they take emails and questions from Yahoo Answers, weirdly enough, and try and give advice, but really it's just comedy and silliness and fun. It's been on the top of the podcast charts for years and years and years. They also have a side project called The Adventure Zone, which started off as them being goofy and playing Dungeons and Dragons with their dad, and then turned into a series of really compelling, like, interactive stories that they were telling together. Collaborative storytelling is my jam, and it's shown well in this podcast, and I also care so deeply about all of the characters in there. Griffin, who is the GM most of the time, is just absolutely masterful. I love everything he does. There are also a variety of podcasts that they do with friends and spouses and stuff. It's literally a joke at this point how many different podcasts they do, so I'm gonna say no more about that. I only have one video game this year, and it's the one that I was playing while I was working on a writing project, and I would just shift windows to distract myself. It's called Crypt of the Necrodancer, and it's one heck of a game. You are stuck in a dungeon, having to make your way to the finish, you collect items, defeat enemies and stuff, but the main point of the game is that the music is like stuck to your heartbeat somehow, and so you have to move with the music, and all of your moves, from like trying to dig for treasure to attacking enemies to picking up items, like they all have to be done in time with the music. It was a delight to play. I really liked it, and I suggest it. I also have only one thing to offer for the music section, but it is one heck of a thing. 5 years late, got on the Panic at the Disco train. I love Panic at the Disco. Are their lyrics garbage? A little bit sometimes. Are their themes sketchy? Also a little bit. Is Brendan Urie a human being? Correct, that is true. However, these songs, like, go into the, like, my very soul and get me, like, moving and ready to take on the world. When I am not feeling it, or I am just kind of or I need to ramp up for something, I listen to Panic at the Disco. I don't know why this specific, like, strange vaudeville emo manic brand of music like speaks to me, but it freaking does. Another loner category is movies. I saw a handful of movies this year. One of them really stood out, and it's an odd one. It's called Believe Me. It's a story about a few frat boys who take advantage of the fact that there's little to no accountability in like Christian charitable giving organizations, and there are a lot of easy manipulation tactics you can use, and they start embezzling funds and making up this fake charity, and it gets wildly out of hand, but then it starts asking some really interesting questions as they get more involved with the church people that they're scamming, essentially. The different ways that each of the characters responds, what they're comfortable with ethically and what they're not. But my favorite part of it is that there are no heroes in this movie. There is no pure good soul who's doing all the right things. It's so easy to do that and to just create a character like this is doing all of the right things and all of these other people are garbage. No, everyone like is a human being with flaws and things that they care about and a moral compass and people that they care about. Even if it didn't have anything to do with the church, which did have a lot of super interesting stuff in it, it would have been a good movie for just the characters and their interactions alone. I got into a lot of new YouTube channels this year, which was really exciting. A lot of them were like video essay style channels, which I've been getting more and more into. You may see some of that in the future. The first is Lindsay Ellis, who does some brilliant like film and culture analysis. A lot of her stuff focuses on the making of content, regardless of whether it's online video and like the persona you have to create there, or Disney movies and the treacherous process to get those made and the different ways that the studio thinks they're going to be successful versus where they actually are successful. She looks at a lot of topics in really significant depth. She does her research, she finds everything out, and she is just so smart that like a lot of the times I'm like just barely keeping up with her, but I want to know everything that she knows. The second is ContraPoints, which is very difficult to describe. It's this weird theatrical production that is still video essay, but in an absolutely wild way. She loves tackling like the most interesting parts of controversial topics, and she loves going in and understanding the mindsets of people that a lot of folks would just think of as like, oh, that's weird. She has videos about incels, the alt-right, pickup artists, fascism, Nazi, like she just goes for it. She's brilliant, and she talks to a lot of different people and actually starts to like empathize and understand a lot of these attitudes without giving them more credit than they deserve. The vast majority of her content is not safe for work. There are a lot of swears and like sexual things in there as well. It's about as explicit as YouTube will let you be. It's not pornographic in nature at all. It's meant to be like part of the video, but if that's not something that you're comfortable with, you should not check her out at all because it's in every video. The third is Royal Ocean Film Society, which I had been subscribed to for a while and did very typical video essay format, but he kind of had a creative breakthrough in which he started doing very much his own thing and experimenting with animation and different modes of storytelling and really getting into his own, which was super cool to watch. It has inspired me to like do more interesting projects that break the mold. It takes stuff that I don't think I could ever have cared about, like the history of animation companies, and makes me like riveted for the next episode. I just spilled tea all over myself. Did I spill it on my shirt? I did. So now on to books. I've enjoyed a lot of AI stories, not just stories about artificial intelligence, but in which an AI is a character, which I find super interesting. Some favorites are A Closed and Common Orbit, Ancillary Justice, and Rogue Protocol. It's super interesting, especially in first-person stories, because if you are an artificial intelligence, basically everything about you is human determined, and so it's super cool to see the perspective of what humans think a functioning being has to be and the way that you would parse things that a lot of humans would consider normal. I actually got so curious about this topic that I did a little bit of research and started experimenting with some writing myself, so it's kind of emerged into like a full-blown interest now, I guess. Another book I loved is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. I love all of the work that Hank does as like a science communicator, a creator of content, a community builder, so I was fairly unsurprised but really curious when he announced that he would be publishing a book. It's hard to say what I liked about it without getting too spoilery, but let it be known that this is probably the most interesting exploration into fame and the culture of fame, especially in the internet age, from someone who has a perspective on that and who has talked to a lot of people with perspectives on that. He also like teases apart some of the like collaborative and cool, but also like echo chambery and bad parts of the internet in a way that is really interesting. There's a little bit of it that feels like Ready Player One, but like so much better, and I say that as someone who like sincerely enjoyed Ready Player One despite its flaws. In terms of genre, it's also towing the line between sci-fi and magical realism, which is interesting. I would highly recommend this book. My Own Devices is a memoir, essay collection, something or another by writer and rapper Dessa. I talked a lot about it in my video on the book after I read it, so I will not say any more here. I also read some really good nonfiction this year. Word by Word is a book written by a lexicographer who is someone who writes dictionary entries. It's self-deprecating without being self-loathing, and it's making fun of the little nerdy intricacies while also being really excited about the little nerdy intricacies. It talks about the nature of language and how it's used. It talks about the way that people think of things as authoritative when they're really just kind of a bunch of people scrambling around trying to record things. It talks about trying to go through all of the different uses of words and try and really tease them apart. It talks about something that's very true in poetry of trying to get the most meaning in the smallest like description possible. It's really fun if you're a language nerd. Give it a shot. If you're not a language nerd, but you're kind of curious about how things come about, honestly, even if you're not interested in the topic, she's just so like witty and funny and enjoyable to read that I suggest that you read it anyway. Another good nonfiction book is Missoula, which follows a bunch of rape cases in a college town. If you need to skip this part, go to this timestamp. It was not only like an exemplary bit of journalism that was like very honest about where like what assumptions the author was making about what he did to fight them, about what he thought was going too far, stuff like that. As a person who really cares about the telling of truth and the finding of truth through research and, you know, stuff like that, I got really, I don't know if excited is the word to use, but I was very into it. It was also on a topic that's very important and that people have a lot of biases about, myself included, and so I thought that it was a really valuable like tool in understanding. It was also interesting to see, just by analyzing these case studies, what can be kind of understood about the culture in which we live, the way that we treat like rapists and survivors and things like that, the role of false accusations. There was a lot of discussion of what that typically looks like. There were so many experts brought in who like have spent their whole lives talking about stuff like this, and I just found it to be like a really, really good piece of work that helped me understand the world better. And on a lighter note, I also really enjoyed The Raven Cycle. It's about essentially this unlikely gang of friends who comes together under one particularly passionate friend's desire to find this ancient Welsh king and like get magical wishes from him. And as this gang of friends goes along, each of them interact with magic in different and interesting ways. I will spoil nothing, but the descriptions of how each of them respond to it and how magic feels to each of them is just brilliant, and I could read them without the story context and still love it. Her descriptions of the characters' dynamic and their affection for each other is just so compelling to me. It talked about group dynamics and relationships within the group in a way that I haven't seen in a while. I don't know if I've ever seen it done this well though, and I loved it. So there are some things I enjoyed in 2018. I hope you all were able to have, if not a good year, at least a growth year, something that you got something of value from. And over the course of the year, we're able to enjoy many stories and bits and games and things. I would love to hear about adorable, amazing ethics professor who has spent his whole life looking at, I love him so, oh my god, because these songs run through my blood. They're such, oh, ugh.